to be fair with the mistakes of the forecast, not only of Walter's mistake.
Con los errores de pronóstico, no solo erró Alberto.
In no case, I remember when the expert teacher launched the policy.
Me acuerdo cuando el profe expert se lanzó a la política.
Which he does in a meeting in New York City.
En una reunión en New York City.
And then, at one point, the Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch, son, took me to a side. We have the honor of having Joaquin here, Senator for the province of Entre Rios. And then he told me, but you are not going to get into politics. Because we need it in the cultural battle, and I told him, teacher, not even worse. Well, I missed a little bit, so God not only missed Alberto, I also miss him. Sir, in that sense, spontaneous order has its own mysteries. The idea today is basically to replicate these talks that I usually have with investors.
De hoy es básicamente replicar estas charlas que yo suelo tener con los inversores.
And that is to show the Argentine case.
Mostrar el caso argentino.
Enough and the achievements we have had over the last almost 2 years.
A lo largo de los últimos casi 2 años.
But basically looking at the future and showing all the potential that Argentina has.
Y mostrar todos los potenciales que tiene Argentina.
From the point of view of the economic growth. That is, why have we entered the path that will make Argentina great again? And in that sense, anticipating part of what I'm going to be saying. When I enter the part of economic growth, one of the things I want to do because surely everyone was here listening to the presentations, and they are still not aware of the tremendous news that has just come out. Today, the bilateral trade agreement with the United States has just been signed. As you will see, we are strongly committed to making Argentina great again. In that sense, one of the things that a businessman looks at. Because the key to understand here is what humanity discovered 250 years ago. So that the world has changed in the way it did. When one has to explain the natural condition of man. If one looks at the history of humanity, the natural condition of man has always been poverty. And that was a constant until the year 1800 of the Christian era. That is when in economic growth theory, what is called a hockey stick took off. The GDP per capita remained constant, and suddenly, from 1800, the GDP per capita begins to grow and to sell more than 15 times. In a world in which the population multiplied by more than 10 times. So basically that happened with the economic growth. One has to understand how the economic growth process works. Because, in addition, in the year 1800, when about 800 million human beings lived on the planet, 95% of the population of the world live with less than $1. And today that number has to be changing all the time because otherwise it would be zero. In a population that is 10 times bigger, it is a little more than 10 times bigger. So in that sense, what one has to try to explain is why that happened. Well, that happened because it increased the stock of capital per capita. It allowed productivity to increase, and that allowed higher salaries and an improved quality of life, not to mention the number of years of people's lives that have been more than doubled. In that sense, the key then is to accumulate capital in terms of per capita. Now, to accumulate capital, the accumulation of capital is achieved in the same way that one makes investments, and that those investments also gain the growth of the population, such that the stock of capital per capita rises. That is, it is not only investment to repose capital, it is not gross investment, but net investment is positive. That is, the highest investment is positive. And for that, basically, free to invest. The first thing that would have to happen is that you respect the property rights. Because if you do not respect property rights, basically you cannot have the result. And if you do not respect property rights, you cannot have the result. And not only that, but also the role that freedom plays. Because when you put a regulation on it, they are ruining your life too. The most clear example was the case of the rent law in Argentina. It can be seen very clearly that when you put a regulation on it, it is also a form of expropriation. It is a form of violating property rights. It is a form of violating what you would like to do with your property. Therefore, both property rights and freedom play a fabulous and extraordinary role in the process of growth. Also life, because if there is no respect for the right to life, we cannot move forward either. That is why it is always so important when we think about politics. Always the normative framework is a definition of liberalism. The process of the City of Freedom in Argentina, Alberto Benítez Danchicho, says that liberalism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of one's neighbor, based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, to freedom and property. In fact, when you take models of endogenous growth, the role of the size of the population is important, which is a bad news for the country. But beyond that, what we are emphasizing here is the role of property rights and freedom. So that when one obtains a result, that result can be appropriated. Now, when you also have the right conditions to invest, and I have already said why the returns of capital are above the cost of opportunity, that is, the interest rate. Have also the interest rate is not a manageable aberration by the central bank. It has to do with the intertemporal preference. The interest rate exists because it exists in the capital. The intertemporal preference, the interest rate exists because time exists, not because money exists. The point is that, in addition, you have to finance that investment. And to finance it, you need savings. That is why all populist experiments are based on Keynesiana. That is, they want to stimulate consumption all the time. To stimulate consumption is to take a shot yourself in the foot, because basically it destroys savings. By destroying savings, it is impossible to invest, and consequently the economy does not grow, or it grows much less than it could grow. I mean, for those who are used to finance. Basically, the logic in terms of looking at this problem quantitatively is that you look at the ROIC, that is, the return on invested capital, or if you want it more basic, the return on assets, exceeds the cost of capital opportunity that would be given by the weighted average cost, WACC. And as the return of assets exceeds the WAC, E in financial terms will have the economic value added, either a positive either. That is, you would be creating value and therefore you would have the incentive to make the investment. But for that again, you have to have the financing. And that financing comes from savings. And again, if you stimulate consumption by the state, or automatically generate expropriations that penalize savings, or control, for example, the interest rate and do not allow the return that corresponds to the situation of savings and investment, you are damaging that growth process. So it is important what they do in terms of savings. It is important what they do in terms of investment. It is important what they do in terms of property rights, and what they do in terms of freedom. And obviously there is also another element that has to do with taxes. Because when you charge taxes, the return on capital falls. Therefore, you have that genius that we raise taxes and nothing is going to happen. That is not fulfilled. In other words, investment is not as it was supposed to be. It is very interesting when you read the general theory, a book that many who are called Keynesians did not read, but it does not matter. First, it is very difficult to quote Keynes because the complete works of 30 volumes. I confess that I did not read the complete works. I did not read the 30 volumes. I only read some other books, with some that I got stuck. I read it several times, which is the general theory, the occupation, the interest, and the money. I read that 5 times, and I wrote a book criticizing it. Or basically, it does the same for consumption as for investment. It has a chapter on investment that, in theory, is wonderful. What happens is that when he writes the next chapter, he says that investment depends on a lyrical, testicular question. Mathematically, it would come to be as given, exogenous. And well, nothing. You can imagine what I wanted to say with the first one. I leave them to your judgment. And the reality is that when you are looking for a feasible investment, you care about knowing if there's a flow of funds. You care about taxes. You care about the interest rate, and you care about growth. So if we say that Argentina is going to be great again, it means that Argentina is going to capitalize strongly. And there is also something very interesting there. There is a Chinese symbol that, at the same time, means crisis and opportunity. The reality is that Argentina, after 100 years of populism, or a little more of embracing socialism of different genders, Argentina has been decapitalized. And after being one of the richest countries in the world, it has become a country of average income, from the middle of the table down, which shows as if that were little. What one has is a counterpart, is that at the moment we came to power, we were on our way to Venezuela. That is, to become in Venezuela was much more feasible than it seemed. So, just as that crisis opportunity was, there is also the opportunity to move forward. Because given the low level of capitalization that Argentina has, that means that the return on capital in Argentina is very high. That is, there are many business opportunities in Argentina. Or specifically, it rises very positively, a very high return on investment ROI. And the trick is in how we do it. To lower the cost of capital opportunity,
unidad del capital.
the average cost of capital, that is, how we lower the interest rate, but not cut from the central bank by hand by bureaucrat, but the market conditions change so that the interest rate is lower. So the first thing one has to explain is, well, then there is a flow of funds. Where is there a flow of funds? That is, where are there business opportunities? Where are there chances of doing business in Argentina? And the truth is that in Argentina there are several sectors that present great opportunities to do business. For example, one of the most important cases is the case of mining. Think, for example, we share the same cordillera with Chile, and Chile exports $50 billion per year of copper. Argentina only 4,000. This means that we are using the cordillera, and consequently we could, for example, multiply our exports by 12.5 times. That is, I have my serious doubts that the Creator has been so bad with us to give all the copper to the Chileans and nothing to us. Those who are looking at the mountain range Cordillera consider the same. That is not a minor issue, because in fact all mining projects, whether it has to do with copper, gold, lithium, the rare earths, basically we have the potential to create 1 million jobs directly. That is why one of the laws we are going to be sending is so important, which has to do with the law of the periglaciers. Basically, you have the glacial zone, and the periglacier is the perimeter from which you can start, for example, to demining activities. Today, that is not well defined. The environmentalists prefer that one dies of hunger. But let's not to touch anything. There is a very primitive attitude. What this law that we are sending to Congress allows is to return federalism to the provinces, and that each province determines which is the periglaciar's own. And the result of that is going to be a great investment in everything that has to do with mining. That's why it is so important, for example, this law of the periglaciers. In fact, that idea is not even mine. The original idea is from the governor of the province of Mendoza, Alfredo Cornillo. And it seems to me that it is better at each province determines where is the periglaciar zone, and that once and for all, we take advantage of the natural riches that have been offered to us. In fact, in terms of RIGI, because they are there also, important sector that we have is linked to oil and gas. And in fact, recently we have announced the largest investment in Argentine history in the agreement between IPF and ENI, the Italian company, for $30 billion. Now, it is also interesting to understand the nature of this business, because basically that will allow, for example, the trade balance that the sector of oil and gas will generate from the year 2031 will be of $50 billion. That is, it would be twice what the Argentine field provides today. Not only that, but also in the RIGI we already have assigned, already approved $25 billion. There are $25 billion pending approval. If we add the case of IPF and E, and add the investment announced by San Alman of OpenEDI for $25 billion, Argentina, during the last year, had an investment announcement for $100 billion. In short, it seems that the trips were yielding a little. And every time we see a mining project, when they announce a mining project, well, I want you to know that that medal is loaded by two people. Today, Chancellor Pablo Kirchner and the Secretary General of the Presidency, Karina Milei, who are the ones who did precisely all the mining rush. But not only do we have everything that is linked to mining, as I just said, copper, gold, lithium, rare earths, everything we have of oil and gas, which, in addition, like these companies that want to get in the mining industry, like those companies that want to get out of the Atlantic what they generate, that is also generating a great interest in everything that is the train sector. In other words, we are going to modernize our railway network. But not only that, but we also continue to have the best farmland in the world. The Argentine farmland had to endure during the Kirchnerism that they brought them $200,000 million, and it is still competitive. It is true that we have not yet finished to eliminate the retention, that we have lowered the retention very strongly, and we have removed a lot of taxes and a lot of regulations, so that the Argentine farmland, without a doubt, is the best field in the world. What happens is that it takes time, and obviously also in terms of the mining sector. In fact, we have gone to further quota with the United States. That is, it seems that trucks are useful for something. But not only do we have that, but Argentina has also decided to reinsert itself in the world in nuclear matter. And basically, there is the issue of uranium exploitation, and there is the development of the small modular reactors, SMR, which will allow us to be a fundamental and central actor in everything that has to do with nuclear energy. All things that were forgotten, left aside, and that had no role, and that today, with the enormous work that Damien Radel is doing, has put us back on the world stage. On the other hand, everything that has to do with where it is linked to artificial intelligence, the investment that OpenAI is going to make in Argentina is not a marginal investment. It's not something accessory. That is, they are going to turn Argentina into a global artificial intelligence hub. One of the important characteristics that Argentina has to offer is cheap energy. And not only that, but low temperatures, which substantially lowers the cost of operation of data centers. And this is not going to be a data center anymore, but it is going to be something truly top-notch. Therefore, let's say, in the field of artificial intelligence, we are going to have a very important role, and that later in the presentation, I am going to explain the role that artificial intelligence has as a mechanism that accelerates economic growth. Beyond that, then what is clear is that they are businesses
que hay
to get a flow of funds,
conseguir flujo de
that is,
fondos. O
with
sea,
which
con
there
lo
are
cual
business
hay
opportunities.
oportunidades de negocio.
That
Es
is,
decir,
Argentina has important
tiene
chances
chances importantes
of
de
supplying the world's
abastecer al mundo
with its two highest
sus
concerns
dos
or
máximas
demands,
preocupaciones o demandas,
which is the
que
demand
es
for
la
energy
demanda de energía y
and the
la
demand for
demanda
food.
de alimentos. Es
That
decir,
is, the
están
conditions are
dadas las
given
condiciones para que
for Argentina to enter a new
entre
century
un
of
nuevo
gold,
siglo de oro,
and that we
y
leave
que
the
dejemos la
populist
barbarie
past
populista
and become again a
y
first
vamos
world
a
power.
convertir en la primer potencia mundial.
On the other hand, one of the things that I also pointed out was the role of
Por
taxes.
otra parte, una de las cosas
Unlike
que
what
también
politicians
señalé era
usually
el
say,
rol de los impuestos.
who say that they are going to lower
A
taxes,
diferencia
and not only that they don't
de
lower
lo
them,
que suelen
but
decir
that
los
after they get
políticos
the
que dicen
electoral
que van a
result,
bajar los impuestos
they
y
raise it.
después no solo que no
I
los
don't
bajan,
know if
sino
it
que
is
después de
true.
que consiguen el resultado
During the
electoral
campaign,
lo
we said
suben.
that we
Nosotros
are going
en la
to lower
campaña
taxes,
dijimos que íbamos a bajar los
but
impuestos.
unlike others who say
Pero a diferencia de
that they're
otros que
going to
dicen que
lower
lo van a
them
bajar
and
y
then
después
raise
lo
them,
suben,
we had shown that we
nosotros
actually lower
habíamos mostrado que
taxes
efectivamente bajamos los impuestos.
throughout these 20 months.
Nosotros,
We
para
eliminated
dar
or
ejemplo,
reduced 20 taxes
eliminamos
and returned to
por
Argentines
20 impuestos
something
y le
never seen in
devolvimos a los
history,
argentinos algo
2.5
nunca
points
visto
of the
en la historia,
GDP
2,5 puntos
in
del
low
PBI
taxes.
en baja de impuestos.
In fact, the tax
Y de
plan that has
hecho,
been
el
developed
plan fiscal que tiene
by the
desarrollado
best Minister of
el
Economy
mejor
in
ministro de
Argentine
Economía de la
history,
historia argentina,
Luis
Luis
Torto
Torto
Capito,
Capito,
is that from here to 2031, if the Argentines decided that this was their
es que
destiny,
de acá
we
al
would return to the
2031, si los
Argentines
argentinos decidieran que
in
eso
lower
es lo que
taxes the
querían,
equivalent of $500 billion.
le devolveríamos a los
That is more than
argentinos
what
en baja de
Argentina has
impuestos
today
el equivalente
of
a
debt, which is
500
$450
millones de
billion.
dólares. Es
That
decir,
is why it is
más que
also
lo que
very
Argentina
important
tiene hoy de deuda, que es 450 mil
that we
millones de
have
dólares.
spent for the extraordinary, not only the budget that has a commitment to deficit zero, but that we also propose
Por eso
a
también
low
es muy
budget
importante
that we send and we send for the other two,
hemos enviado para
so that in those 3
extraordinarias no solo
years,
el presupuesto que
that it
tiene
has a commitment with the deficit zero.
déficit cero,
It also has a commitment that once and for all,
de que de una vez por
we
todas
take up
saquemos
the
de la ley
Colchón law,
Colchón, o sea, la
that is the
presunción
presumption
de
of
inocencia
innocence
de
of
los
Argentinians,
digamos, no es que, digamos,
because for
porque
the
para el fisco
Argentinian
argentino se
taxes,
invertía la carga de la
the
prueba,
burden of the
somos
proof
todos
is
culpables
inverted.
hasta que se demuestre lo
We are all
contrario.
guilty until the opposite is proven. If not also, what we are going to do is send another tax package.
Sino también lo que vamos a hacer es enviar otro paquete
To also
tributario
lower the
para también
taxes to
bajarle
Argentinians.
los impuestos a los argentinos.
And as we continue
En
to
la
grow
medida
and that a
además que
surplus
sigamos
financial
creciendo
super
y
habit
que
is
se
generated,
genere superávit financiero excedente,
we are going to
vamos a
continue to
seguir
lower the
bajando los
taxes as
impuestos
we have been
como
doing.
lo hemos venido haciendo.
But not only that, but it is also important
Pero no solo eso, sino que también es
what we are
importante
planning in terms of employment
lo que estamos planeando en materia
and
de
modernizing the labor
de
laws.
modernizar las leyes laborales.
That is what has to do not only with eliminating the litigation industry,
No solo con eliminar la industria del
but also with the
juicio,
concept of we have 7 blocks.
también con un concepto que a nosotros son 7
But basically what has to do with the concept of pre-election,
tiene que ver con el concepto de prelación,
which is that the smallest agreement kills the biggest agreement.
mata acuerdo más grande.
That is,
decir,
a
un
business
acuerdo de
agreement
precios
kills a
mata
municipal agreement.
a un acuerdo, digamos,
A municipal agreement kills a provincial agreement. A provincial agreement kills a regional agreement. And a regional agreement kills a national agreement. That, for example, there is a work of the University of San Andres, the advanced macro students of Dr. Stezenegger, which basically compares the productivity of the Pampean area with the northwest area. And there it shows that the productivity in the Pampean area is 20% higher. Consequently, the conditions are fixed according to the Pampean area,
las condiciones se fijan acorde a la zona
He
pampeana,
destroyed jobs in the northwest area.
puestos de trabajo en la zona del noroeste.
If he basically allowed those agreements to be made regionally,
Ustedes permitieran que se hicieran en forma regional esos acuerdos,
employment in the northwest area would go up by 17%, and that would allow the governors of the region to release resources, that they would not have to be taking public employees as a source of permanent unemployment insurance, but would also release resources either to lower taxes or to do the work that they do not do. That is, to dedicate themselves to the tasks of the format we have, which are in charge of education, security, health. So that would also allow them to increase the productivity of the provinces. So that would be all profit. That's why this law is so important. But apart from that, why is this type of issue so important? And why are salaries mapped with productivity? Because the transformation that is taking place in Argentina is so important that it will require the reassignment of resources. And as long as you have more flexible labor markets, the only thing we can allow is that people can find employment very quickly. In fact, if we are going to be generating such a large amount of taxes in the service sector, you are going to have that the currency is going to be appreciated inexorably, and you are going to have reassignment of resources to the non-service sector. That is, the service sector. People are going to want to go to a restaurant or go to see a show, to have a more normal life. And what is going to happen? The consequence of this is that the service sector is going to expand a lot. And his service sector is the one that is more intensive in work, and is going to allow this to pay much higher salaries. So people are not only going to be able to get jobs, but also those jobs are going to be much better paid. Consequently, it is a very important law forward, but also to correct the problem that we have. That is, anyone who looks at the numbers of the labor market and sees that 50% is in informal clearly cannot say that rights are being lost. First of all, because all those who have acquired rights have the power to continue under the contract that they currently have. So none of the insiders lose rights. And those who are in the informal market do not have any rights. So they are going to have rights. Therefore, I say that we must not be psychopathic because of these lying swindlers, who all they want is to secure their personal businesses at the expense of the job and the hunger of good Argentinians. On the other hand, I am talking about the issues linked to property rights, to freedom, to respect for life, the possibilities of doing business. But this is very good. But what happens if someone violates these rights? Well, that is why we are also sending the reform of the criminal code, making the penalties harder, because so that in Argentina the one we have been saying is fulfilled, that the one who does them pays them. But not only that, because this is the extraordinary package. When I met with our famous Minister of the Interior, that guy from outside the series, who is the Carlos Centelli, this is the extraordinary package. Now I pass you the extraordinary package and continue. What I want to say is that we are deeply grateful for the support that the population has given us in these midterm elections, where we won 41 to 24 to the Kirchhoffs, and we are closing the populist night. Thank you. And otherwise, it's good to show gratitude and gratitude with words. What you see is that we are going to validate it with the facts, continuing to be the most reformist government in Argentine history. Thank you. Having said that about the reforms, about the potential of businesses, and what we are going to do in a positive way, there are two additional discussions left. The discussion of the interest rate and the discussion of growth. One very important thing is to understand is what the interest rate is. Because the feeling that one has is that the vast majority of economists do not know what the interest rate is. That is, economists, instead of being part of the solution, are part of the problem. The truth is that the profession has lost its compass. Because honestly, it is quite offensive for an economist. To hear an economist say that the interest rate is the price of money, that is quite an aberrant thing. Basically, the interest rate is the relative price of the present assets with respect to the future assets. That is, the interest rate exists because time exists, not because money exists. Basically, when you want. The good thing is that, as this audience understands a lot of Austrian economy, therefore, what I'm going to explain is not esoteric, but in other contexts it is. Basically, when you look at the determination of the interest rate, it is determined by the interaction between saving and investment. And saving is neither more nor less than future consumption. Therefore, if you think about a general equilibrium system in such a way that the income effects are cancelled, because what one earns will be lost by another, it means that the only thing left is the effect of substitution, specifically the demand curves of a negative slope. Therefore, if the price of the present assets with respect to the future assets goes up, what you are going to see is that the present consumption goes down in favor of the future consumption. That is, when the interest rate goes down, what you are going to have is that if the interest rate goes down, the current consumption goes up. And if the interest rate goes up, the future consumption increases. That is, you are going to see that then, if the interest rate goes up and the future consumption increases, it means that savings increases. Consequently, you are going to find a functional relationship that shows that savings goes up when the interest rate goes up. And naturally, the same goes for investment. Because when the interest rate goes down, it means that the future assets are more expensive than the present assets. And that has the incentive for you to move the production of the present to the future. That is, the investment increases. That is, how do you move the production of the present to the future? With investment. And in that context is where you determine the interest rate. Notice that the money does not play any role there. It is all linked to the real sector. So, if one wanted to take a photo of the interest rate, the first thing one would see is that one of the components. Look at this. This can be done exposed. You don't have to pretend to do it ex ante. Since we are Austrian, we are not going to do that. We are going to look at the photo. We are not going to believe what we can determine from the photo. I ask you, please, because this is no less. If you look at the components of what the interest rate is, one has to do with the tempo preference. In other words, if you have a whole set of people who are in a hurry, well, obviously, the interest rate is going to be a monstrosity because they want to consume everything now. Therefore, it is going to be very high because the present is going to be much more expensive in the future. Another element that plays a very important role in the interest rates is the country's risk.
el riesgo país.
For me, some things.
A mí, algunas cosas
The intellectual dishonesty of some economists surprises me.
me sorprende.
Some because of ignorance,
Ignorancia, otros
others because they have a bad intentions.
Ahora, lo que
Another
sí
thing that I cannot internalize or assimilate
internalizar o asimilar
is that people who have been sitting in the electric chair
la silla eléctrica
ignore the risk.
ignore el riesgo Cuca.
In other words,
Es decir,
they were so
estaban
eager to
tan
predict the
calientes
earthquake
por predecir la hecatombe que
that
todo
all
iba a
this would
volar
blow
por
up.
los aires,
554,
¿sí?
0, 40, 37,360, 0, 40, 41,360, and try to generate panic among the people who basically were looking for the interest rate spread to predict a devaluation and deny the kicker risk. The reality is that if the interest rate is the relative price of the present goods with respect to the future, the kicker world, which is a communist world, and that does not stop every day making communist recommendations, I think it's unbelievable. Twitter is more fun than ever. Listening to the QQ speaker is monumental. The other day, they wanted to impose tax on the cashier. Now, let's say, now they came back with the inheritance tax. They didn't renew at all. I mean, they're still living in the Stone Age. But beyond that, in a profoundly expropriating world too, the reality is that it's like when the Pope said in an article, Juan Carlos de Popo has a wonderful article called The Economy as a Decisive Process. So when they present the scenario of the future, they say, well, there may be three scenarios. One is the status quo, it doesn't change anything. So the relative prices, if they don't change anything, they don't have to change. Then there's the scenario of the universal flood. I mean, there's going to be a soap opera, and based on that, the whole trick is to get a ticket for the nose art. What color is the nose art ticket in Argentina? Now green. In fact, that's the way to paradise, violet. But apart from that situation, the other scenario is the scenario of the end of the world. And the scenario of the end of the world is that there's no tomorrow. The QQs, in terms of capital, are the scenario of the end of the world, because they are the relativization of the worst of Pyrrhonism, of destroying capital. Consequently, how much of the future could worth there? Zero. Therefore, the interest rate is infinite. Well, that's the kicker risk. And economists who try to promote the evaluation and openly, they want this government to go wrong. Especially there's one that is saying apocalyptic things all the time. I mean, because they're resentful for something else that has happened. So, I mean, it seems that he forgot that he was an impregnable, that he couldn't walk on the street, that he had to go out camouflage until someone revalued him. But apart from that ungratefulness, let's say, he denied the QQA risk. Well, the 26th election gave him a clear class, because we reduced the country's risk enough. Not only that, but also, Argentina had the best historical streak in stock market, doubling the value of the shares. As a consequence of the fall in the country's risk, it seems that indeed there was a QQA risk, and the only ones who backed for freedom Luckily, with the Argentinians, where 2/3 of the Argentinians said, "Cucas, never again." So another important part is the country's risk. And the country's risk has to do with insolvency. Insolvency, or is with its opposite, intertemporal solvency. What is the intertemporal solvency issue? The intertemporal solvency is assured when the debt-product relationship is not growing. That is, it remains constant or falls over time. Argentina has a zero deficit policy. Argentina has a zero deficit policy. It is one of the 5 countries in the world that has a financial surplus. The rest have a deficit. That is, only 5 have a financial surplus. The remaining 190 have a deficit. That means that the debt does not rise. Therefore, with the expansion of the GDP, the debt-product relationship is falling. Therefore, inexorably, we are going to beat the country's risk. We are going to exterminate it. On the other hand, if you are a company and you go as a company, you have a part of the risk that is a specific risk. Well, that too. We have had to endure nonsense. During the campaign, that talked about, no, the macro is fine, but the problem is the micro. Hey, the macro is the sum of all the micro. Therefore, if the macro works well, what is that about the micro? That is, it is one of the things that was wrong. The other is, when you find an economist or a politician making a lot of emphasis on the micro, well, you are an indicator that they are corrupt. Because what a politician has to do, from my point of view, is to level the field, that everyone has the same field. In literature, this is called don't pick the winners. That is, don't choose the winner. So, if someone comes and starts talking to me about the micro, what is the next step? Let him come and talk to me about the candle sector, the day Edison invented the lamp. And guess what is behind that? Corruption. Therefore, let's be very careful. When a politician or an economist appears to them, they say, no, well, but the micro, because that in the background is a lobbyist who is trying to influence public opinion for acts of corruption so that they win what they have to lose. And that means to pass the bill on to all Argentines so that those who are not efficient benefit and that the pass-by benefits. Therefore, be very careful with that. In that sense, basically, we are working on pulverizing the country's risk. And not only that, but also, when you have a monetary economy, the interest rate would escalate in what terms? You should also contemplate the effect of the inflation rate. And one of the things we are doing is lowering inflation. When we got to power, the inflation rate was running at 1.5% daily. If you take the wholesale inflation, which is the one that leads, it was 54% monthly. If you look at the monetary imbalance that the central bank had, which had about 4 monetary bases, in one day, we were able to multiply the amount of money in one day, plus the equivalent of 9 monetary bases in debt in pesos, beating in less than 3 months, plus the fact that there was a surplus that was twice as much as Rodriguez's, which could have multiplied prices by 12. Inflation by 12, sorry. We had all the conditions given so that the inflation rate could go
a niveles que oscilaban
the levels that oscillated between 15,000 and 20,000%. It's just enough to do the math. If you have enough. Although, I say the inflation data from yesterday was 2.3%. What we have to. If today the inflation is 30%, there is still a long way to go. We have achieved a lot, but there is still a long way to go. But I want to give you 2 lines of hope. The first one is that monetary policy has a lag that oscillates between 24 and 26 months. According to a study from the University of Cordoba, and for those who unintentionally, from journalism, get the account wrong because they say, well, it's been 20 months. The inflation should have already ended. Now it's from the moment when the monetary emission stopped. Not only did we make the biggest fiscal adjustment in history, but we also did it in record time. The other day, Churchill said that the Minister of Economy of the world meet with the Minister of the United Kingdom, and he said that he had a fiscal deficit of 5 points of the GDP, and that he was going to correct 1 point per year, and everyone applauded him. We made deficit zero in 1 month. What we didn't achieve in 123 years, we achieved in 1 month. In addition, we lowered 2.5 points of taxes. I warn you that the real adjustment we made was from 7.5 points. That is, we lowered the public spending in real terms by 30%. And that is to give back freedom to the people. Because what Rothbard said was that the real fiscal pressure was the size of the public sector, and we have lowered the public spending by 30% in real terms. Look, if we are giving back the public spending, the real public spending in real terms, look, if we are giving back freedom to the people. For the issue is that was only a third of the deficit that we had. In the central bank, we had twice the deficit. We had a fiscal deficit of 10 points of GDP, and that took 6 months to fix it and make it zero, which is also a great achievement, and that, unlike other intellectually dishonest people who made the previous minister make a Bonnex plan and then gave us the corral and then went back, they made large expropriations. We did all this while respecting property rights. What does this mean? Because the other day I was listening to a journalist who is actually an operator. I mean, he is a hetman. And he said, no, well, but then he is close to the months the inflation would have to disappear. We have to tell the man that the amount of money we can just fix last year, with which for the middle of next year, or for the month of August next year, the inflation in Argentina will have been a bad story that ends. And what we also have to understand is that inflation is not neutral, it distorts relative rates, it distorts investment, and as we lower the inflation rate and the price signal flows freely, uncleanly, because inflation is to the price system what noise is to the communication. The more noise there is, the worse it communicates. But it is not because the one who transmits it does it badly and the one who receives it doesn't understand it. It is because there is noise. Well, inflation does the same as resource allocation. Therefore, as we eliminate inflation, there will be a jump in productivity in the economy as a consequence of the elimination of inflation. It is the same effect once and for all. And the other important news set, I think, is worth mentioning. Another of the myths that we have broken down is the idea of the pass-through, that when you evaluated that was going at a price. We explain the Hume-Cantillon effect and everything, but we also understand that we have in 100 years of history, 90 years of history, where people were scammed with the inflationary tax, and that they understood that the dollar was an anticipated indicator of what was coming, and we, the opposite of the fact that the Argentine economy was dollarized by the equivalent of 42% of M12, the largest number since the return of democracy. I mean, there was never an attack of such characteristics. Even so, the program resisted. I mean, the program was good, but not only that. What? When you look at the passive monetary base of a central bank via the non-refunded, the monetary base and the remunerated at the time of Pada, different remunerated instruments. It was a number so that you can more or less get an idea. When Sturzenegger was president of the central bank, that number was $120 billion. Later, with the arrival of the QE risk and the destruction that took place in the capital market in 2019, when Kirchnerismo won, which is why people who denied the QE risk continue to be strange in order to try to force their terrible argument from the intellectual. So what happens? When you look at the size of the monetary passives from the last part of his month until we arrived, it was a number that oscillated between $35 billion and $45 billion. That is, when they reached $45 billion, a devaluation was generated. That devaluation made the passers of the central bank go down to 35 billion. There, the individuals were positioned in a cup, and there they began to carry trades, and they returned to 45 billion, and the crisis returned. It was a number that oscillated between 35,000 and 45,000 billion dollars. In essence, one of the things that happens is that on average, the passes of the central bank oscillated at $40 billion, and we, despite taking measures that were strongly criticized, for example, imagine if we had left the $20 billion of the AFIs on the street. I mean, today we would be telling a story. What some quite nefarious economists who seem to understand little started criticizing the measure, but apart from that, who don't have the intellectual honesty to recognize the error. What seemed incredible was that that level of $35,000 billion basically implied that work capital would be destroyed in the economy. So those whoever company know how difficult it is to build work capital. That work capital is linked with a life cycle. The dream what is charged and what is paid in a company, the cash that people use to make transactions. So it was a very difficult to break, because apart from that, if that floor was during their Kirchnerism, clearly it seemed like a counter floor. Well, the attack that we have received during the last 8 months, because let's not forget that all this attack began with an absolutely destituting Congress of the nation, systematically voting every week laws against macroeconomic balance, the attempt to rot it in the street, that is, different mechanisms for which they tried all the time to sabotage the government. In essence, basically what one has is that, incredibly, the passive monetary of the central bank today is $25 billion. That is, the Argentinians decided they sued so much panic that they even ate $10 billion are the capital of work. And if you clean out, because of the effect of increase in cash, probably the number exceeds $15 billion. That is, in despite path attack, we are on our feet. We won the elections, and we are on the way to Argentina Grande. Therefore, in the face of that, fall in the demand for money, the inflation rate should have been absolutely unblocked, and yet it was oscillating around 2%. Therefore, as the demand for money and the economy continue to grow, it is also a fact that the inflation rate is going to explode. Finally, what remains is now to explain the economic growth. We have explained the sectors where Argentina could be generating this growth, and which are also evident because it is being generated. But now let explain the basis of long-term growth. And there we basically have three engines. The first engine is the ministerial pickle office that Acosta is nega, which is the Ministry of Deregulation, and which should be called, well, call it the Ministry of Growing Performance, but it is very naughty that we call it the Ministry of Growing Performance. So we put deregulation so that they understand us. But in reality, the idea of that ministry is to release growing performance. Growing performance means that an increase in the productivity of the factor that you are looking at. If you remember, I started the presentation talking about the hockey stick. That is, the GDP per capita remained constant until the year 1800, and from the year 1800 the GDP per capita rose 15 times in a context where the population multiplied by 10. That is, the GDP of the world multiplied by 150 times. So the point is that if I had growing performance, if it rose, the population multiplied by 10, the GDP should have multiplied by 10. Well, if it did it 150 times, those are growing performance. That is, production rose much more than proportionally. In general, in the neoclassical theory, that it is associated with the existence of God. If I want to put myself an exquisite in terms of terminology of general balance, I would talk about non-convexities. If I want to get more intuitive, I would talk in terms of concentrated structures, or if I want to make it easier, monopolies. That is a polar case within the concentrated structures. And from the perspective of the neoclassical economy, that is wrong, and then you have to regulate them. When you regulate the monopolies and try to assimilate them to competitive companies, the opposite of that is that by killing the growing performance, you kill the economic growth. In that sense, one of the things that happens is that when you look at those countries that have more regulatory burden, for example, Europe, they are the countries that grow the least in the world. That is, when you regulate and kill the growing performance, you are killing the economic growth. Then, in that sense, as we move forward in the regulation process, we release growing performance and the economy grows. And that is the idea that we have from the Ministry of Regulation. It is interesting because in the last 20 months, we have made 10,000 structural reforms while we are releasing growing performance. That is why I always say that we are the most performist government in history, and I have no doubt in saying that we are also the best government in Argentina. In addition, not only have we fulfilled all the promises that we made in the campaign, what we thought we were going to do in 4 years, we did it in less than 2. I want to tell you that a way to honor the support we had in the last 20 months is to continue with our reformist agenda, and we are going to continue deregulating and making structural reforms because we are not going to stop until Argentina is the freest country in the world. The second engine of economic growth is, because I am in the order of the presentation, it is not because it is pondered in another way, because in terms of cash, it is the one that we put first. From the first day, there is no money for anyone except for Minister Petrolo. Here I have witnesses who can validate that, but it is human capital. So where does the idea of human capital come from? There, by the year 1956, two economists separately, when Robert Solow, on the other hand Travis One, developed a growth model called the neoclassical economic growth model. The model was a total sensation, and then, following year, Robert Solow went and tested it empirically. He could not explain the economic growth with this model, which was very nice in mathematical terms. What was a problem that only explained 15%? That is, the instrument was very nice, but it explained nothing. So, in that context, one of the things that happened is that the replica that they was from the University of Chicago, that the Department of Economics was managed by George Stigler, said, your problem is that he did not contemplate human capital. And there, in the University of Chicago, two versions of human capital were born. One that is the best known, which is the micro version, which is Gary Becker. Everything that is Gary Becker linked to human capital. Look at what I trip you. We meet Gary Becker. We gave him human capital. And on the other hand, the macro version of human capital was in charge of Girofumi Ashawa, who was a Japanese. He was the one who teaches the doctoral thesis of Mio Sidreski, who is probably one of the 5 greatest economists in Argentine history. So look how close human capital is to us. However, at that time, academia, instead of positioning itself on this way of working on Girofumi Ashawa and looking at human capital from a bisectorial growth model, it decided to go for the idea of technological progress, and technological progress was determined by the finger, that is, with which economic growth ended up being explained by the finger. There is still a very funny anecdote, because I remember that I did not witness it, but I have no reason not to believe those who told the story. At a meeting of the Association Argentina de Economía Política, an economist refuted another, saying no, but that is finger. And the other answer is, well, but let's say, and it might either also do like that, he says. He says, well, but the finger is, several since it was a finger a little more qualified, but beyond the schema, literature decided to go that way, and that is why later literature practically disappears until Robert Lickers Jr. appears, who, after determining his contributions in rational expectations, begins to dedicate himself to the topics of economic growth, and in the year 83, Paul Romer appears and his doctoral thesis develops the theory of endogenous growth. There is a strong expansion of everything that is the theory of endogenous growth, and that debate is practically finished in the year 1989 in a work by Gregory Menkel, David Rama, not Paul Rema, David, Roma, and David, while what they do is empirically test the hypothesis with human capital, and they go on to explain 85% of economic growth. And he says, well, the debate is, Dinesh, economic growth is human capital. Human capital has two dimensions. It has human capital of the first generation and human capital of the second generation. The first generation has to deal with the feeding of children and with the health of the children. If you look at our human capital ministry, one of the very important things it has is all the part that is of childhood and family, which is to give attention to the children when they arrive. That is whether the plan, for example, 1,000 days or that the universal assignment for children was duplicated in real terms. But we also did something that they said was impossible, which was to finish with the marriages of poverty. Wow. There were things to posterity, finish all that. And that is complemented with the action of the Ministry of Health. Now, the human capital of the second generation is the one that has to do with the part linked to education. And there, we are also working very strongly in all the stadiums of education, but to get there, the children first have to be well-trained and healthy. But we are also working on a new program of literacy. We are also working on a lot of reforms so that education is at the forefront. But with all, that is not enough. That is why within the human capital is the Secretariat of Labor, and this is together with the Ministry of Economy and together with the Ministry of Regulation. They are the ones that are designing the labor reform. I want to make a note of color about the written on the lies of the journalists. The lives of the journalists operate in favor of those. He did not want them to make the reforms. And it has been at least 15 days that the only thing they do is to meddle with this reform. I warn you that. And then cabinet meeting yesterday, they were making the conciliation between the work of the Ministry of Economy, of Total Capital, the Ministry of Regulation of Stisnega, and the Ministry of Human Capital. And Sandra could not go to the meeting, but Cote works on this sale. They are taking the lead and they are finishing to perfect it, and this is incredible because the journalists have all the criticism. They do not let themselves be psychopathic by those lies. All those who have read, who are writing about the reform are all liars. They are all swindlers because I have them here as witnesses apart from the cabinet that yesterday the conciliation was finished. And the work is now legal and tactical to harmonize the three proposals. In other words, in the meantime, the media were talking about all this, so all those who listen, all the journalists who were listening to talk about this, were all liars. I mean, so they know what they are on the other side. But not only that, but also there are people who were left out of the system, and we work on the reincorporation and reinsertion in the labor market of those who were left out of the system. Therefore, not only are we modifying the conditions so that people can develop and can contribute to economic growth, but we are also working on the conditions of the labor market so that those who are out of the system can reinsert, and from now on they can also be much more productive. And finally, the other thing we are working on is the matter of international trade. And what we are doing is working to make the Argentine economy more open, because those economies are more open, are more productive, and are richer. And the best reflection is that today the bilateral agreement with the United States came out with the prophets. As the apocalypse said that the thing was going to come out. Thank you. And now we have the bonus track. Leave what you are seeing where it is. Thank you. But beyond this humor, the bonus track is what comes in the matter of artificial intelligence. The idea of the hockey stick, and the one who saw it first was Adam Smith. The second book, the first was the theory of moral sentiments. The second is the research and the law of nature and the causes of the wealth of the nations. The fourth part is basically a Grice model, and the idea of the factory of hockey sticks is the idea of the grain yields. That is, a single person can produce only 20 hockey sticks. If you basically divide the task into 15, the production per capita jumps to 5,000. That is, they go to produce 75,000 hockey sticks. That is the idea of the growing yields, and whose limit is given by the market. That is, you are going to gain productivity by dividing the work. If you have demand on the other side, that said, artificial intelligence would come to be like a factory of 21st century hockey sticks. And that is what could accelerate the process of growth and convergence. For example, we say that by maintaining this trend in 10 years we will appear to Spain, in 20 years we will appear to Germany, in 30 years to the United States, and in 40 years we will be the first world power. However, with artificial intelligence, we could appear to Spain in 5 years, to Germany in 10 years, to the United States in 15 years, and be the first world power in 20 years. Therefore, from there are strong bet by artificial intelligence, and meanwhile, on the other side are the stone ages that want to regulate it to the point of killing it before it is born, the sea stone ages. Therefore, by doing a recount at everything we said in my mind, because I'm not going to repeat it again, because I'm not going to repeat the conference and what we are doing in terms of flow funds are enabling that the economy, that the agents can express in times of investment projects, in low taxes, in low interest rates, and to enhance economic growth. I have no doubt that after what happened on October 26, Argentina will be great again. Thank you very much.